Davos, Bitcoin shocker, live from the World Economic Forum 2025, where Klaus Schwab, Larry Finks, and BlackRock are gathered. And so on, they meet and want to decide about your life here. What you should do and what you shouldn't. Bitcoin is mentioned here multiple times. Bitcoin is a hot topic here. And a central banker makes a huge fool of himself on stage when he's asked about Bitcoin. We have statements from Brian Armstrong, who is really stepping up here. For Bitcoin, we have further statements. Where they are here. People are really stepping up on stage for Bitcoin, and sitting next to the Bitcoin advocates are central bankers, along with some folks who want to sell you something. That you won't own anything anymore, but you want to be happy. It looks like the time of the Klaus Schwab pros and so on is slowly running out, and people are realizing that they don't want to be messed with anymore. People are getting that freedom is better than coercion. People are realizing that we don't need gurus who dictate what you should eat and what you shouldn't, who dictate which money you should use and which money you shouldn't use. People are realizing that they want to become independent individuals now. And people are also getting that Bitcoin is a big part of this and that Bitcoin can be the solution here. Check this out. It actually says here in an article from Zero Hedge, and we're also going to take a look at all the statements here live. But here it says in an article, Davos shocker. Countries around the world have been keeping an eye on strategic Bitcoin reserves thanks to Trump. That means it's happening actively here. Talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves in Davos. And not just on one stage, but on several stages and even in discussions about the times. And there are now several confirmations. But first, let's see what Brian Armstrong has to say. Larry Fink was invited again to a discussion here at the World Economic Forum. Here is the president of the International Monetary Fund invited, who basically wants to ban El Salvador from using Bitcoin as legal tender. Here are big leaders Emmanuel Macron, Merkel, Christine Lagarde, of course, the head of the central bank, and many others in attendance. And now a Bitcoiner comes in and drops this statement.
Check this out. Balance on deficit spending in inflation. Because if things ever got too out of control, people can just flee to Bitcoin for safety. Yo, I heard people talking about having the for the new it states swear. Every crazy. Here, if there's a loss, it's paid out as a dividend.
They're actually talking about it, that Bitcoin could be a problem solver here. For the state deficits, that the states are just spending way too much money here. And here they're actually talking about it, that Bitcoin can be a solution for the deficit problem. For the national debt, because Bitcoin is here. States' heavy debt leads people to Bitcoin, a safeguard and limit on state control. Then people will just flee into Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is basically a safeguard for every citizen and also a limitation for the state, so they can't control the people too much, they can't exploit the people too much. So they can't inflate the people away too much. And now, they're even talking about the concept of a sovereign wealth fund here. In America, for example, the USA buying Bitcoin. We buy, for example, every year, 200,000 Bitcoin or something like that, and by the age of 18, every US citizen would then receive, for example, 0.1 Bitcoin or 0.001 Bitcoin. And so you can basically create prosperity for generations in America. And back then, we had some ideas at the World Economic Forum about ways, how can we, for example, restrict democratic freedom of speech? That the idea doesn't somehow take hold in the free market, but that we are basically the bosses and the dictators of the World Economic Forum. Here, we can just hammer opinions into people. The ones we want to impose on you, those were the topics that were discussed here before. And now they're discussing topics like a strategic Bitcoin reserve, a sovereign wealth fund in the USA, where every citizen benefits from it. Hear about the Bitcoin price increases. And they're talking about how citizens can protect themselves here. Systematic, because Bitcoin is a regulatory mechanism for the states, because they cannot lean out the window too much and cannot get into too much debt. Because otherwise, people will just flee into Bitcoin, and we now have these possibilities. And right now, everything is turning 180 degrees. It might also have something to do with the whole Donald Trump situation, that now freedom topics are being discussed at the World Economic Forum, and it's not just about that anymore. Okay, we're now going to dictate what you can eat. You all have to eat bugs from now on. You can't eat meat anymore, you can't do whatever anymore. You can't even drive a car anymore. For all I care, you can't even fly anymore. But the craziest part is, this is just insane. World Economic Forum, it seems like a new plane is landing every minute. And then they fly from the airport to the World Economic Forum by helicopter. So they come by plane and then fly the rest of the way by helicopter. But they want to sell you on it. That you shouldn't emit any more CO2. That you really shouldn't fly anymore. That you should only eat bugs from now on. And that's really the absolute hubris. that's currently going on here. And it's awesome that Bitcoin has made its way into the freedom discussion here at the World Economic Forum. But hey, it's about to get even crazier. What you have just seen was nothing at all. That was basically just to grab your attention. Now there's actually a central banker here along with Brian Armstrong, Anthony Scaramucci, and the CEO of Franklin Templeton. So with a bunch of Bitcoiners, that's basically a central bank governor, and it's the central bank governor of Africa up here on stage. And they're discussing Bitcoin together. And now there was a final audience round where the viewers just asked questions. So, what's the deal? Bitcoin and blah blah blah. And then there was this really cheeky guy here. He basically called out the central banker from Africa here. What's the deal with a strategic Bitcoin reserve? When is Africa going to do that? And you can really see that the pressure is coming from the people now. Now central bankers, including Christine Lagarde, have to respond. Let it out. Christine Lagarde is still trying to suppress it. When she's asked about Bitcoin, she just ignores the question, but she can't suppress it forever. And now, the central banker from South Africa is basically being confronted. Just like I think Christine Lagarde will also be confronted in the future. It will. And now just check out how they're totally embarrassing themselves on stage and what kind of response there is.
In fact, there is indeed only one answer.
I can't say I'm in the mood to choose between the technology that blocks this asset and the asset itself. As regulators, we don't regulate the technology. We regulate the activity. We're technology agnostic. That's why I said it's not for the government, which products the consumer should use. The technology is very useful. I give the idea for you.
So he's kind of beating around the bush here. He starts off saying a quick no, but I think that wasn't really an answer. He's doing it basically the way my teacher used to say. If you can't convince them, just confuse them. He says yes, something about the underlying technology is here, important and so on. So what's being talked about here in the end isn't really that essential. The important answer is coming up at the end. House.
Let's dive a little deeper. We piloted a blockchain technology. Payment space with finance. Let's go. BG in central banking, money, and dive deeper. In 46 seconds, 46 minutes, we were able to do that. The technologies could be useful. We would take a look at that. I don't think that's a problem. I would have a significant problem with a lobby that says the government should hold this asset or that asset without knowing what the government's strategic intentions are. Because, you see, there's a history to gold. There used to be a gold standard. The cards were backed by gold. Packed. But if we now say, okay, Bitcoin, okay, what about platinum? What about coal? Why don't we hold strategic beef reserves or Martin reserves or Apple reserves? Why Bitcoin? So it's a public policy issue that we need to engage with. So good cooking compliments. The move that would say, that is I'm getting myself together. I would offer it to society, and society needs to hold it as a reserve. I would have a fundamental.
It's really not that easy to be funny anymore. I don't know if that was comedy or what exactly he said here. He definitely says he rejects it here. He would have a problem holding Bitcoin as a reserve. But he thinks the underlying technology is great, of course, which is definitely an oxymoron. You can't say on one hand, yeah, hey, Bitcoin or crypto is awesome, but on the other hand, we don't want to make it a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Now he's going even further. And I just told you that. If you can't convince them, then confuse them. Then he just says, so examples, yeah, like why shouldn't we just create a meat reserve? Why shouldn't we just create an Apple reserve? Why shouldn't we just create some other reserve? Why do we absolutely need Bitcoin? And he really doesn't seem to get it here. He really doesn't seem to get it here. That Bitcoin is absolutely limited here. He's embarrassing himself here too. The others probably laughed at him completely. So I didn't see the reaction here, because you couldn't see it directly. But if I had been on the panel there, I probably would have laughed my ass off there. Because, I mean, you can't compare apples and meat with Bitcoin. Those are two completely different things, because he also talks about the gold standard and says, yeah, we used to have gold as money. And back then, gold was the backing. And it was clear that makes sense too. And it made sense back then, because gold has a certain scarcity. Because gold just had a lot of money-like properties. It was difficult to reproduce. It definitely had a certain durability and so on. Just the properties we had back then. 1971. Fit perfectly. Back then, there was no Bitcoin and so on. And if we just set up a strategic apple reserve or a strategic meat reserve, the properties just aren't there. Meat rots, apples rot. Meat isn't limited either, and so on. And Bitcoin has all those properties, like here, the absolute limitation, divisibility, fungibility, verifiability, and so on. And that's why it's pretty obvious that Bitcoin is a suitable means to build a strategic reserve here. And apples and bananas or whatever, of course, they don't work either. Besides, it seems he hasn't understood here that there's a difference between Bitcoin and blockchain. What's still here? In the 2017 blockchain or something like that, they were trapped, where you think here. Blockchain is the solution for everything, but Bitcoin can't be the solution here. And that was already it for me. The absolute embarrassment so far here at the World Economic Forum. Of course, it didn't go over well here. There were, of course, a lot of nasty comments here in X, and so on, where people basically went after him and said, "Hey, how can you argue like that?" Here, Brian Armstrong then responded here and said, "It's pretty clear that Bitcoin is being considered as a strategic Bitcoin reserve because the properties are just awesome. It's better than gold and a lot of other things. More." But there was even an absolute highlight. Brian Armstrong explains here in an interview highlights, or should I say, backgrounds. At the World Economic Forum, what's still happening here is, and that really shocked me a lot.
We've just seen incredible growth, and I think it hit an all-time high yesterday. Yeah, I'm really good about it, but I think that over time we'll see Bitcoin hit the million price range. Into the million price range. Pure. Is being adopted by more and more institutional clients. The ETFs have brought in a large number of inflows. If we were to have a clear legislative period in the US, that would be a huge milestone. The strategy of the Bitcoin reserve, if the US had taken this path, would likely have the rest of the G20 following suit. Indeed, I've discussed with some finance ministers here in Switzerland from various countries around the world that the idea of a Bitcoin reserve strategy is now of more interest because the US is looking into it.
Did you hear that? He says here that the finance ministers here in Davos confirm that they now have massive interest or not. There's massive but additional interest in Bitcoin here ever since Donald Trump maybe announced a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And now, basically here, more countries are open to Bitcoin. He's saying here that Bitcoin is going to hit the millions, so several million. And if the US sets up a strategic Bitcoin reserve, then all the G7 countries will probably follow suit. Guys, can you imagine what kind of impact this is going to have on the Bitcoin price? Then we definitely have the Valhalla candle going here, the Godzilla candle that people are still dreaming about at night. But that could soon become a reality. At least here, according to Brian Armstrong, if Donald Trump really goes through with it. If the other G7 countries follow suit. And the interest is there. He clearly says that he's in contact with more and more people. Here with finance ministers, with big players. And people here are also asking questions. Just like how Bitcoin is being talked about here on stage now. About a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So will they, the Putins or the Xi Jinpings? The president of China, not the CEO. The president of China, the Ching. And for sure, they're all going to at least think about Bitcoin. Thinking about it, okay, strategic Bitcoin reserve, yes, no, how do we respond to the US? Because that's what it really comes down to. Something like, let's say, a Cold War, but not on a physical level, rather on the currency level. Something like a currency war. Something like a money fight and so on. And here it's really interesting, what's going on back here and so on. And that's why we need to keep a close eye on this, how this is going to play out. And now I actually have a really big recommendation for you. And specifically, if you have Bitcoin on an exchange, I definitely recommend to pull the Bitcoin out of here. To keep Bitcoin in self-custody on your own hardware wallet. I'll put a link down below for a TREZOR hardware wallet because that definitely takes away the counterparty risk. Especially now in these interesting times. We've seen it happen again and again in the past. Exchanges get hacked. Then something goes wrong, someone makes some mistakes. And then the Bitcoin is just gone. And that's how you can protect yourself. By having a hardware wallet where you can manage your Bitcoin safely and securely without any hassle. Without counterparty risk. Here, with the code Bitcoin Hotel, you get a 10% discount when you buy one of those TREZOR hardware wallets. I'll put a link down below, and also, if you want to buy Bitcoin, check out 21bit. Coin, the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can save up to 20% as well. See you, take care. Peace out.